Hello and welcome back to Crafty Not Shifty. Today I'm going to be sharing with you my September 10 cards 1 kit video featuring the Love From Lizi card kit. So here I'm just taking one of the patterned papers and cutting it down to 4 1/8 of an inch by 5.5, and this will completely cover the front of my card base. All of the card bases that I'm using today have been made from the A4 sized cardstock that was included in the kit, and I've actually cut this down to 4 1/8 of an inch, which is the measurement that you get when you cut A4 sized cardstock in half vertically, and then cut it to 11 inches. So this is a really comparable size to the standard letter size that's used in the US and Canada. When you make cards from standard letter size paper, they measure 4 1/4 by 5.5. Okay, so I've covered this with this beautiful paper. I loved the papers that came in this kit, and I actually had a really hard time cutting them up, but I just about managed it. And for this particular card, I decided to add a large sentiment from Mama Elephant, which is just a note, and then it says underneath, "Wishing you another year of joy and laughter." And I thought this sentiment would work really well to send a card to Lizi to commemorate her 1-year shop anniversary, so that's exactly what I did with this card, but it works just as well for an anniversary or a birthday. So here I've got some of these sequins. So I think these sequins, I actually got these in an earlier kit, and I had some left over and they worked really well with this colour palette. So I'm just using my Sticks to sticky pencil and some multi-medium in the matte finish to add those sequins, and I just finished it off with a peel off along the left hand side. Okay, so here I've got one of the mini envelopes and I'm covering it with Cracked Pistachio Distress Oxide ink. As I'm sure you've heard by now, the Distress Oxide inks are different to the normal Distress inks, and one of the reasons that they're different is that they are opaque. So that means that the colour will show up on dark cardstock, and if you layer it up like I'm doing here, it will actually completely cover that cardstock. So I'm just using a little finger dauber to apply that ink, and then I used a heat tool to set it. You could just leave it to air dry as well, but I was in a rush trying to get all of these cards done, so I decided to speed things up by using my heat tool. And then once that first layer was dry, I just went ahead and added another layer. So once I've completely covered that with an additional layer of the ink, I'll just set that to one side to dry, and I'm going to take another one of the papers and cut that down to be, again, 4 1/8 by 5.5. And this is really similar to the other card in that I'm taking one of those like watercolour patterned backgrounds and covering the entire card front. I honestly think I could have done that for all 10 cards in this kit. I could have just took some of this beautiful watercolour paper, covered an entire card base and added something in the middle or added a large sentiment, and I would have been really pleased with how these turned out because the papers are just so beautiful. So here what I'm doing is I'm using one of the scraps and I'm taking a die from Simon Says Stamp that cuts out a whole bunch of different hearts in, they're all really small, but they're all slightly different sizes and shapes. And I just ran that through my die cut machine multiple times. I think I actually managed to fit that 4 times and just ran that through, and then all of those little hearts, I just kept them in a little dish. So I would have them nice and handy when I come to stick them on my card. So once I had all of those cut out, I'm just going to stamp my sentiment first of all, and I want to make sure that I've got space for it in that bottom right hand corner, so that was why I decided to stamp that first. So I'm using the Nevertheless She Persisted, and then I'm just squeezing the sides of this envelope, and I added some sticky dots, some 3D foam dots inside, just to kind of keep that open. So I want it to look like it's really full and it's sort of busting open with all of these hearts. So I've applied double-sided sticky tape across the back, and I'm just trimming off the excess and then peeling off the release sheets, and I'll stick that down to the card base. So I've sped you up here and I've got my hearts in the little dish, and once again I've got that pickup pencil and a multi-medium mat with a fine tip precision applicator on the end of the bottle. So I'm just working my way through, sticking these down randomly, sort of just filling it up right at the opening of the envelope and letting them spill out towards the top right hand corner. So once I'd finished layering up the hearts, I decided to add some glossy accents to the heart that's on the front of the envelope, just to give that a nice amount of shine and make it look like a 3D element. I think it just adds something extra to the front of this card, and that's this one done. Okay, so moving on to card number 3. Now, I decided to use some of this pearlescent card and this edge chomper. So what you do here is you chomp a piece out and then you line up the pattern with the pattern on either side of the punch, and then you just press it down again and it continues on that design. So I did this for all of those pieces of paper in the different colours, and unfortunately I was having so much fun making this card that I actually didn't realise that my camera had run out of battery, so parts of this are missing. But essentially what I'm doing here for this green piece of paper, I did for all of the different pattern pieces. And you can see here I cut them into narrow strips, and then I used my ATG tape runner to apply them to the front of a green card, and I just offset those slightly as I worked my way up the card. So I left this last green piece slightly larger, and my original plan was that I would have two different colours here, and I changed my mind. So here I'm just lining up my leftover of that pearlescent green cardstock, and I'm just going to go ahead and apply some HEG tape and lay that down on top. And there I was just considering again, maybe I'd use a different shade of green, but I changed my mind and went back to that pearlescent. And then I'm just going to trim off the excess. And you'll see in a minute how I cover up the sort of like the seam where those two pieces meet to make it look like one cohesive piece of cardstock. So while I was busy crafting away with my camera turned off, I die cut the peacock using the peacock die that came in the kit, and also some of the silver pearlescent card, and then I used this frame die to create a background using the purple pearlescent card. So here I'm getting some double-sided sticky tape, and I'm going to lay this across that seam where those two pieces of green cardstock meet, and I'm just moving that closer to me so I can make sure that that's nicely aligned. So sorry that's off camera, but I'm just laying down that sticky tape. I let it hang off the edges, and then I used my non-stick scissors to cut off the excess, and then I'll just peel up that backing sheet. So I've laid down a piece of white scratch paper just because these little gilding flakes can be pretty messy, so I wanted to be able to catch all of the mess. And I'm just using the smallest amount on the tip of my finger and pressing that into the adhesive, and I do have this sped up quite quickly. So I just pressed all of that firmly into the adhesive and then used a brush to buff off the excess, and then used a microfiber cloth to pick up any of the pieces of foil that were left floating around. So I've added a million, I don't know why I used so many, I might as well have just die cut an extra piece of craft foam, but I used an awful lot of foam dots here. I like to use a lot of foam dots. I like to think that, you know, I want my cards to travel well and I want them to stand the test of time, so I do tend to use a lot of adhesive, and if I'm using foam I tend to use an awful lot of it to make sure that whatever I'm popping up doesn't have the ability to sag down in the middle. So it takes a little bit of extra time, but there we go, there's a million foam dots on that piece. And here I'm just using a glue pen to apply some adhesive to the peacock. The peacock is just so beautiful, it's such like an intricate die. I really like this die, and I just think it works beautifully with these colours and with the pearlescent shine on this card. So I left a sentiment off the front of this card. I just think it looks really pretty the way it is, and I decided to stamp one on the inside. So again, I'm using one of the stamps from the kit, and this one reads, "She turned her can'ts into cans and dreams into plans," which I think is just such a nice sentiment, so I'm really pleased that that one was available in this stamp set. Okay, so on to the next card. We've got another really quick and easy card. For this one, I'm applying once again a whole bunch of double-sided tape. This time I'm using foam tape, and I'm just laying that down on the back of a piece of patterned paper that I've already gone ahead and cut down to cover the front of my card. And this is some of the pearlescent like watercolour paper. And I'm just trimming off the excess of that foam, and you can see here I'm kind of cutting at a slight angle, and that's just to make sure that I cut the foam really nicely and you can't really see it outside the edges. So I'll peel off the backing, and then I'm just going to lay that down on my note card slightly offset from the side, and to help me with that positioning I've brought in the frame stamp which I'll be using on this card. Okay, so now that's placed down, I decided to edge this with some of the peel-offs. For anyone who's been getting the Love From Lizi kits for a while, the peel-offs have become somewhat of a staple. These glitter peel-offs are beyond my favourite. You have to kind of feel them to understand. There's glitter on them, they're really shiny, really glittery, but because the glitter's encased inside a layer of plastic, they're completely smooth to the touch, which it's hard to explain, but it's quite something when you see them for yourself. So here I'm just using a few of the scraps because I'm literally obsessed with these peel-offs. So yeah, any of the extras get saved and I use up any of those little pieces. And you can see here, once you lay them down on top of each other, you actually can't tell. So I'm just pressing that down and then trimming off the excess. And I just think it makes that small panel really pop. So here I'm adding some anti-static powder tool. This is just to help with embossing. It stops the embossing powder sticking to any areas that you don't want it to, where there might be some like oils or some static cling on the card. So in the kit there was a mini Versamark ink cube, and I'm just using my full-sized ink pad, which has got the exact same ink inside it. It will do the exact same thing, but I already have this one open, so I didn't want to open up the mini cube just yet. So I've pressed that down and you can see it's left that clear sticky ink on the card, and that's what I'll use to apply the embossing. Inside that frame I'm adding another one of the sentiments, and all of the sentiments from this kit actually fit inside the frame, so I think that works really well the way that that was thought out. So I've got the embossing powder here. This is the first Love From Lizi embossing powder, and it's just a beautiful green colour. So I'm sprinkling that over the top and then tipping the excess off again onto a piece of scratch paper, so I can just pick up that excess and use the paper to funnel it back into the jar. I did have a little bit of extra embossing powder there that stuck where I didn't want it to, so I just used a dry brush to brush off the excess, and then I'm tipping all that extra powder back into the jar to save for later. Again, I've got my heat tool and I'm just applying that to the embossing powder, and you know when the embossing powder is heat set, because it turns really nice and shiny and it just changes from that powder to being almost like a melted plastic. So I've got some more sequins here. I believe these are the sequins that came in the kit. They have like all different little pieces in there, so there's sequins, but there's also some smaller size sequins, some discs, and also some stars. So here I'm just going through and applying a few of the different sequins just to sort of frame up that sentiment area and add a little bit more interest to the background of this otherwise quite plain card. So here for this sequin I actually decided to cut it in half and lay it next to that popped up panel so I could make it look like it was poking out from underneath that piece. And there we have it, that card is finished. I just think that pearlized watercolour looks beautiful. Okay, so this next card design is a really good way to use up some of your scraps that you might have. Any of those, you know, special pieces of paper that you just can't quite bring yourself to bin, even though there really isn't that much to use on a card. This particular type of card is really good for that. So I just decided to do it because I wanted to use as many different patterned papers as I could, and I really liked all of these patterns, so I just picked a few of them, cut some equal length strips and applied some adhesive onto a plain white card base, and then just lay them next to each other, making sure that the edges buttered up together nicely. And then once I'd gone over all of that, I trimmed off the excess, and I just really like the way it leaves this sort of subtle pattern in the background, and again it's a really good way to use up some of your scraps. Okay, so while I finish up with that paper, fair warning, I decided to cut apart my sentiment. So I know that freaks some people out, so that's why I'm giving you a warning here. It's perfectly fine, it doesn't harm the stamp, it will still stamp perfectly well. You just have to be careful to make sure that you only cut the areas of the photopolymer that aren't raised upwards for you to stamp with. So I cut in between the words so I could have this particular sentiment in two pieces to help me with my positioning. Now, you don't have to cut your stamp apart to be able to do this. You can just use masking as well, and that's fine. But for this particular sentiment, I wanted to cut it apart and use it in this way so I could use my MISTI tool and make it really quick and easy to stamp this without having to worry about any masking. So one of the reasons I'm using the MISTI here is because I know that I've got different layers that I'm trying to stamp on. So I've got the flat white card base, and then I've got that slightly raised area with the patterned paper. And I wanted to make sure I could get as best an impression as possible between those two different areas. So for this butterfly here, I'm using my chameleon marker pen that came in the kit, and I've outlined that in a dark shade just by using the pen exactly as it comes, and then I held the pen in the fuse chamber for a few seconds. As you can tell, this is sped up, and then I just coloured from the centre outwards. So I bent this a little bit so there would be some dimension behind the wings, and then I applied some adhesive just along the body, and then used some teeny tiny foam squares to pop up the wings. And again, I just think it adds some interest to the card rather than having something stuck down flat. It just provides a little bit of movement and something extra to draw your eye. So after this particular card was done, I kept coming back to it and thinking that it was missing something. So off camera, I went ahead and added a line of the Nuvo drops just where the butterfly's body would be. For this next card, I'm starting with a green card base and some slightly smaller green pearlized cardstock that I was right in the middle of applying HGG tape to when my tape runner ran out, and I didn't have a refill to hand, so no problem, I just switched to using some liquid glue. And actually, I think liquid glue is slightly better when you're applying something with a really thin gap that you want to leave right around the edge, because that liquid glue just gives you a few seconds wiggle room so you can make sure that placement is exactly right. So here I've got a pre-cut panel that layers nicely into the centre of this card, and again I'm just going to use that liquid adhesive to press that down and then apply a grey strip across the top section of this card. So I went ahead and coloured one of the stickers, and I used the green pen that came in this month's kit as well as the purple pen that came in last month's kit to colour those, and I was just deciding exactly how I wanted the orientation of that, and then I pressed that down. So you'll see as this card goes on, it was actually a bit of a mistake to press all of that down so firmly, but no worries, I managed to fix it. And here's another mistake. I stamped first with my Distress Oxide ink, and it was a little bit too light to show up on the busy pattern in the background, but I just went ahead and stamped over the top of it using my VersaFine Onyx Black ink. So then I trimmed off the excess of the strip of grey cardstock that's across the front, that pearlized cardstock, and then I used my Nuvo drops to add some detail to the inside of the flowers. So after adding the Nuvo drops, I still felt like something was missing from this card, so I decided to take my craft knife and peel up that sticker and bring in some peel-offs. So they tend to be the answer for any card that's missing a little something extra, and I just worked my way around that panel in the centre, adding the peel-offs as I go. And I had to lift up that pearlized grey piece as well. Luckily the glue was still wet enough that it allowed me to lift that up. And then I basically just outlined everything. I worked my way around that panel and then either edge of that grey section. And then I brought back in my sticker and I decided to outline the sticker as well. So these peel-offs, I used the really thin one, and as long as you work quite slowly and you press it down firmly as you go, you can bend these to follow around a circular shape, and I just think it adds a little bit something extra, and I think the card looks a lot better now that I've added those peel-offs. So I think the takeaway for this card would have to be, if in doubt, add more peel-offs. On to the next card. Here I've got a panel that I've pre-cut for the top section of this card, and I'm going to use the peacock die to cut out a window, and I'll use that window to create a shaker card. So it helps if you actually use your post-it tape to stick the item down and then it won't shift. And I ran that through my die cut machine, and I'm actually going to use this negative space to be my window for the shaker. And to make sure the shaker elements are nicely contained inside the card, I cut some acetate and added some double-sided sticky tape all around the outside edges, and I'll just stick that down over that pattern piece to contain all of my shaker elements. So to give my sequins inside of this shaker card some room to move around, I've got some 3D foam tape that I'm just going to work its way around, and again, similar to how I did with the peel-offs last time, with double-sided foam tape, as long as you take the release paper off the front and the back, it's actually quite easy to manipulate it around the outside edge of a shape. And I've layered up all of that tape so it's actually twice as thick as usual. And my favourite way to do that is actually to take a long strip of the tape, fold it in half on itself, and then use it that way. So it's double the thickness whenever you go to use it. So I'm just shaking in some of the sequins, and I made sure to include some of the tiny little pieces as well, and I filled it up so it was nice and full, so when the card stood upright there's still enough interest going on with those sequins, and when you shake it around for me I think it's more satisfying when the shaker card is really full. So I'm using a piece of purple cardstock and I'm sticking that to the back of the shaker, and that helps me contain all of my shaker elements inside, and it also gives me a different colour through the window of the shaker card. So it's just a little something slightly different when you're making a shaker card. You don't always have to stick it flat to the back of the card base. So I have another piece of cardstock here that I'm going to use as the bottom section, and I wanted for this card to have a different colour on the top and the bottom, just for something slightly different. So again, I'm applying some double thickness, double-sided sticky tape, double-sided foam tape. I think I've said sticky tape a lot in this card when I mean foam tape. Hopefully you guys could all see that I mean foam tape for this shaker card. So I applied that, and then I've got one of the ribbon buckles and some of the ribbon. So I applied one ribbon and then I pulled that really tight so I'd have enough room to pull the next piece of ribbon through. And then to apply this to my card, I used again some double-sided tape. I do mean tape this time, not foam tape. So I used some double-sided sticky tape to help me apply that ribbon to the front of the card. Once I had that excess ribbon trimmed off, I carefully used my craft knife to just push in the extra ribbon that's hanging off the sides underneath the foam tape that's securing that panel I created onto the front of the card. So if I'd have thought about it, it would have made more sense to do this before I'd stuck the panel down, but as always I didn't plan that far ahead, so I just made it work by using my craft knife and carefully teasing that ribbon underneath. So as with all shaker cards, before you're finished you have to give them a test and shake them around, and to finish this card up I decided all it needed was a sentiment, and I decided to use the "Nevertheless She Persisted" in that bottom left hand corner using the VersaFine Onyx Black ink. For this next card I decided to create another one very similar to the first one I created, in that I covered a card base in a corresponding patterned piece of paper, and then trimmed off the excess and added a large sentiment. However, this time I decided to do something slightly different than just stamping the sentiment on the background, and I used an oval die cut to cut out an oval pattern that would fit in the middle of this card using this sort of ombre pink and purple cardstock. And I decided that that was actually my inspiration. The ombre pattern here was the inspiration for the ink that I used. But before I get to my stamping, I'm going to go ahead and glue this down to the front of my card using again that Tombow liquid glue. And once that's in place, I'll ink up my sentiment, which is also by Hero Arts. And you can see there I made another mistake, I dropped this piece. But I managed to wipe up that glue and it didn't leave any marks on the back of the card. So here's that wooden sentiment, and I'm using my ombre ink pad here. So I'm starting off in the center, and then I'm just doing sort of like a little like cha-cha-cha forwards and backwards to make sure that those inks blend really well. And then because the sentiment is bigger than the ink pad, I'm just filling in the top and the bottom with the corresponding light and dark inks. So I went ahead and pressed this down on my card, and I applied quite a lot of pressure. So with red rubber stamps it is a slightly different experience, I suppose, with the stamping, and you do get a really great impression with red rubber, but I wanted to make sure, because it was a large stamp, that I'd given it enough pressure and enough contact time with the paper to transfer nicely. So to finish this particular card off, rather than using the sequins, I decided to use the teeny tiny silver stars that are included in that sequin shaker mix. And again, just as before, I'm using my pickup pencil and my multi-medium in the matte finish to apply those just around the sentiment on that oval panel. So moving on to the next card, again this is another great design that you could use to use up some of your paper scraps. This obviously isn't one of my scraps, but I decided I wanted to use this pattern paper and try and do something a little bit different to how I've done some of my other cards, where I've just laid the paper down exactly as it is. So I punched all these different circles and laid them out in a design that I liked across a white card base, and then just used my glue to stick those down and made sure that some of them were hanging off the edges, so it looked like I'd used almost a polka dot patterned piece of paper, but I'd created it myself using one of the papers from the kit. So I'll trim off all the excess, and then I actually use those to finish off the design, so I didn't want to cut up too much of my paper, so I just made sure to use those extra pieces where I could. So here I've got a piece of the lace. This lace is beautiful. I hadn't worked with lace before, and I found that it was easier to cut when it was held firmly in place, so that's why I'm using a clamp here, and I'm using some really sharp fabric scissors as well. So with lace, I found that it was a challenge to figure out what type of adhesive to use. I decided to run it through my creator sticker machine. So I don't know if that's the best way to apply it or not, but it seemed to work for me. So I carefully fed it through and ran it through my machine, and that just allowed just enough of the adhesive to stick on the back of the lace design, so I could stick it on the front of this card. And as I say, it hasn't fell off yet, and it hasn't left any sticky residue on the empty space in between the lace pattern. So I'm just laying that down across the front of the card, and it is still slightly bigger than my card base, so I'll go ahead and trim off that excess in just a moment. So to help make sure that adhesive is all stuck down, I just used a scrap piece of paper and laid that over the top to protect the lace, and then rubbed all over that to apply firm pressure and make sure everything was stuck down. And then once I was happy with the positioning, I just trimmed off any of the excess. So I wanted to apply a piece of the velvet ribbon to this card. I think the lace and the velvet work really well together, so I applied some double-sided sticky tape to the back of the ribbon, and then peeled off any of the excess and stuck that down on the card. And I actually cheated just a little bit here, so I not only wanted there to be ribbon, but I also wanted there to be a bow. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but I struggle to tie bows. It takes me forever. So if anyone's got any tips, then just let me know. So I edited some of that out, but there was me tying a bow, taking far too long to do it. But eventually, when I was happy with my bow, I just used some glue to stick that down. And I just think that's a nice way of cheating to get the bow on the ribbon without having to worry about getting it tied perfectly. So I'll set that aside to dry, and I'll stamp my sentiment. So I've used that same circle punch and a scrap piece of white cardstock and punched out a circle that I will stamp "This Girl Can," and I'm using my Hot Mama ink from Simon Says Stamp. So I've stamped that slightly off to one side, and that's because I'm going to be trimming off some of the excess that I'm going to hang over the edge of the card, and I'm applying some foam dots to the back of this. And here I decided that when I held it up against my card, I actually felt like it needed just a little bit something extra. So I pressed it down onto my card and I trimmed off the excess. And I took a good look at it and I thought, I'm not quite happy. I don't think it stands out enough. So I cut this scalloped circle. So the scalloped circle that I cut is almost exactly the same size as the circle that I used for the sentiment. So I'm hoping this is going to make sense. So I went ahead and cut that apart into different sections, and then I stuck it down onto the back of this white circle, just allowing some of the scallops to hang over the edge and making sure that I continued that pattern. And it allowed me to make it seem like I had a scalloped circle punch that was larger than this circle punch and would allow me to have this extra. So I hope that makes sense. You can see there I've just sort of paper pieced everything together, and I'll apply adhesive over the back of the paper and then press that down. And I just think that looks a whole lot better. It really draws your eye into the sentiment instead of it just getting a little bit lost in that background. Okay, so on to the final card in this 10 cards 1 kit video. And for this one, I'm using a dark blue card base, and I'm going to be doing some heat embossing. So here I've got the frame, and I've inked that up with my Versamark, and I'm stamping that roughly in the centre of this card. And then inside of that, I'm going to add one of the sentiments. So the type of embossing powder that I'm using here is Ranger's sticky embossing powder. You use it exactly the same as any other type of embossing powder, but instead of thinking of it as an embossing powder, if you think of it as almost like a powdered glue, that sort of helps you understand what it's used for. And yeah, that's kind of the best explanation I can give. So go ahead and heat set it exactly the same as you would with a regular embossing powder. The difference is once that's heat set, it's actually really tacky, so it will allow you to stick things to it, such as glitter, or as I'm doing here, I'm using the gilding flakes. So I pressed those down again exactly the same as I did with an earlier card, rubbed them into any of that adhesive, and then just used a microfiber cloth to clean up any of the excess that was left behind. So to finish off the background of this card, I decided to use a whole bunch of the peel-offs, and I just lay those down right across the card in a crisscross pattern and just created my own sort of crazy design in the glitter peel-offs. I really liked how this looked actually. I hadn't tried it before with the peel-offs, but I think it's a really nice way to create a patterned background, and it's really quick and easy to do. So once I'd finished laying those down and I'd trimmed off all of the excess, all I needed to do was apply this to a card base and this card would be finished. So to do that, I used my liquid adhesive and I just applied that all over the back of that pearlized blue cardstock and stuck that down to a craft note card. I decided to add just one more thing to this card before it was finished, and that involved a little bit more stamping on the inside, and for that I used the flower from the set and also my Versamark ink and just created a watermark effect by stamping that down and letting the Versamark ink dry. I think that works really well on craft cardstock in particular. Okay, so that's it for today's video. That is all 10 of the cards, and I'll just give you a recap of what each of those look like by bringing each one back on screen for you to see again. And while I've got you here, I'm just going to remind you that the Love From Lizi birthday blog hop is in full force. If you haven't already checked it out, then you can start at any one of the design team members' pages or the Love From Lizi YouTube channel. Just find the video with birthday hop in the title, watch that video, leave a comment, and also remember to like the video, and then just hop on to the next one. In total, there are 12 stops along the hop to celebrate 12 months of Love From Lizi, and there are also 12 incredible prizes to be won, and the top prize is actually a year's subscription to the Love From Lizi card kit, which I think anybody that's watching this video would definitely appreciate, so make sure you go and enter if you haven't already. It really is an incredible giveaway. So that's everything from me today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, let me know in the comments section and hit that like button. If you're not already a subscriber, then go ahead and hit subscribe, and I hope to see you back here again soon. But that's all from me. Bye for now.